Evening. As we meet here this evening, a radical overhaul is underway of our political system, economic, financial, social, as well as cultural system. A new constitution is being discussed. At the same time, there is a plethora of radical reforms being rushed through. The fact that many of these reforms are being challenged as unconstitutional indicates that the new constitution is aimed at making what is unconstitutional today constitutional tomorrow. In other words, making legal what is illegal by a simple trick of changing the law with a capital L. The issue is not whether a new constitution is needed or not. It is the fundamental and inalienable right of the people to determine the economic, social, political and cultural system in which they choose to live. But that choice will be theirs only if it is made freely, not with a gun pointed at their heads. Today, Sri Lanka finds itself practically under a form of tutelage to the United States, which is a global power whose strategic objective is to maintain its global hegemony. It is symbolic that the US ambassador chose to announce Washington's decision to assist Sri Lanka draft its constitution and also to implement the Human Rights Council resolution, standing on the amphibious warship USS New Orleans, which is used to land and support ground forces on enemy territory and patrol provocatively close to China. It is also ironic that it is from Temple Trees that the acting US Secretary of State Alice Wells declared last week that the United States is and will continue to be an Indo-Pacific power. She was the first also to announce America's first ever naval exercise in Sri Lanka in October in Trincomalee. You will agree that rewriting the Constitution under such conditions can only advance Washington's cause, not ours. There are other guns also pointed at us. The 2015 Human Rights Council resolution, as well as the notorious IMF World Bank conditionalities. Good governance, or Yahapalana, was not invented by Ranil or by Chandrika, Sirisena or Mangala. It was coined by the IMF, World Bank, and the US Treasury as a political conditionality for the enslavement of indebted countries such as ours through further indebtedness. Behind these threats is the same face, Washington's. The international financial institutions such as the IMF are dominated by Washington, which controls nearly 50% of the IMF vote share, that is together with its European allies, compared to Sri Lanka's 0.19%. Let's be clear. The demands in the Human Rights Council resolution are not Burundi's, not Cuba's, or Russia's, or China's. They are Washington's. It was Yahapalana's abject servility that made it possible to use it as a weapon against us. The reforms demanded are so fundamental that they cannot be implemented without changing the Republican Constitution. A hybrid court is one. Another is the devolution of power, which is a project to dismantle the state. Yet another is the conversion of our armed forces into an auxiliary of the United States Armed Forces against our national sovereignty, independence, and also our territorial integrity. That will require wide-ranging security sector reforms, demilitarization of the North and East, which means 2/3 of our coastline, control over recruitment, vetting of officials, ending military involvement in civilian activities, etc., etc. Underpinning this resolution is the demand for accountability. Accountability is also the pillar on which the so-called responsibility to protect, or R2P, stands. And the goal of R2P is to legitimize US intervention and domination. In the late 19th century, the US and Great Britain justified their savage wars of peace as the white man's burden to bring civilization and progress to barbaric, non-Western, non-Christian, non-white peoples. Today, the justification is responsibility to protect citizens of other countries. The moral rhetoric is human rights and humanitarianism. The victims are the same. R2P, or responsibility to protect, is a project of recolonization associated with tutelage. In a report on the responsibility to protect, the United Nations Secretary General called for revising the UN trusteeship system. That is, the system of tutelage for non-self-governing territories, colonial territories. Now, the original proposal to revise the UN Trusteeship Council came from the former US Ambassador Edward Marks, who was also Deputy Chief of Mission in Sri Lanka in 1987. Marx talked about an international regime of tutelage for multi-ethnic societies, which he called failed states. US interference in Sri Lanka began long before the resolution was adopted. But it was the Yahapalana regime that gave it wings and also international legitimacy. The US Secretary of State, John Kerry, arrived in Sri Lanka to fix the roadmap even before a legitimate government was in place. The visits to Sri Lanka of Jeffrey Feltman, the UN Under-Secretary General for Political Affairs, were also significant. On his first visit, shortly after the 2015 presidential elections, Feltman declared that he was here to assist in the process of accountability and reconciliation. On his second visit, that was last month, he revealed what he had meant. He had meant change in the Constitution. He was here this time to monitor progress made in change in the Constitution. Who is Feltman? He is former US Assistant Secretary of State, a neoconservative hawk, linked to Robert Kagan, their theoretician, Victoria Nuland, and Samantha Powers. Feltman has been involved at the highest level in regime change, in destabilization, the breakup of sovereign states into ethnic enclaves, fomenting violence. I would require more time to give you an account of the role in covert operations that he played in the Ukraine, Russia, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Moldova, Georgia, Venezuela, Colombia, El Salvador, etc. Other significant visits were that of Samantha Powers, also known as the liberal war hawk, and of George Soros, US multi-billionaire, who believes we don't have enough constitutional democracy. After the Council resolution, things moved into high gear. 3 months later, the Prime Minister, ours, announced the establishment of the Constitutional Assembly. 2 months afterwards, along with US aid, he announced that Washington would be requested assistance, and also the European Union and the UK through the Westminster Foundation for Democracy. The Westminster Foundation, by the way, was funded by the US Foreign Office to set up political parties in the former Soviet bloc countries following the collapse of the Soviet Union. In July 2016, the US Assistant Secretary of State, Nisha Biswal, visited Sri Lanka, and she admitted there was a direct link between the Council resolution and the new Constitution. That was just before the US ambassador's announcement from USS New Orleans that Washington would assist with drafting. What began as an agenda to abolish the executive presidency was transformed overnight into a full-blown reform of the Constitution. With the new Constitution, as with the resolution, the Yahapalana regime is trying to convert us Sri Lankans into Washington's little soldiers who will defend a hegemonic vision based on invisible threats. That is what the Indian Ocean Conference that was recently held at Temple Trees was about. What are these invisible threats? Where is the evidence? These are legitimate questions. I would like to conclude by quoting the response to these questions by former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. He said, he was referring to Iraq, he said, "The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. There are things we know that we know. There are known unknowns. That is to say, there are things that we know we don't know. But there are also unknown unknowns. These are things we don't know. Each year, we discover a few more of these unknowns." That's a quote from Donald Rumsfeld. In this regard, I will leave you with a question to think about. It was posed by the famous American writer and filmmaker Errol Morris, and I will quote from him. Imagine someone tells you there's an elephant in the room. You search the room, open the drawers, you check the closets, look under the bed, no elephant. Absence of evidence or evidence of absence? Friends, fellow patriots, if the Constitution is to be ours, written by a free people, we must resist this diabolical project. Thank you.